He reached the cluster of huts that were Craddock's, and turned aside at the house-place door, whistling a few bars of the latest tune running in the legions, with which he was used to announce his arrival. The leather apron over the doorway was drawn aside at once, but instead of the hunter there appeared a girl with a solemn sunburned baby on her hip. She was tall, as were most British women, and carried herself like a queen. But the thing that Marcus noticed about her was the look on her face, a queer guarded look, as though she had drawn a veil behind her eyes, so that he should not see in. "My man is out behind with his chariot team. If the commander goes to look, he will find him," she said, and stepped back, letting the leather apron fall between them. Marcus went to look. The sound of the hunter's voice and the horse's soft whinny gave him his direction, and making his way between the woodpile and the tethered cock, whose feathers shone with metallic colors, among the duller hens, he reached the doorway of a stable hut and looked in. Craddock turned to the doorway as he appeared and gave him a courteous meeting. Marcus returned it. By this time he spoke the Celtic tongue fluently, though with an appalling accent. But he was staring into the shadows behind the other man. "I did not know you drove the Royal Fours in these parts. We are not above learning some lessons from Rome. Have you never chanced to see my team before?" Marcus shook his head. "I did not even know you for a charioteer, though I suppose I might have guessed. The British are all charioteers." "The commander is mistaken," Craddock said, drawing his hand down a glossy neck. "The British can all drive after a fashion. Not everyone is a charioteer." "You, I take it, are a charioteer?" "I'm accounted among the best of my tribe," Craddock said with quiet dignity. Marcus had moved in from the doorway. "May I see your team?" he asked, and the other stood aside for him without a word. The four were loose in their stable, and they came to him almost like dogs to sniff inquiringly at his breast and outstretched hands. 4 superbly matched black chariot ponies. He thought of the Arab team he had sometimes driven in Rome. These were smaller, under 14 hands, he judged, thicker coated, and for their size a little more heavily built. But in their way they seemed to him without match, the heads that turned to him gentle and intelligent, the ears pricked and delicate as flower petals, the quivering nostrils lined with vivid red, the breasts and the haunches deep and powerful. He turned from one to another, moving among them, fondling them, running a practised hand over their lithe bodies, from proud crest to sweeping tail. Before he left Rome, Marcus had been in a fair way to becoming a charioteer, in Craddock's sense of the word. And now desire woke in him not to possess this team, for he was not one of those who must be able to say "mine" before they can truly enjoy a thing, but to have them out and harnessed, to feel the vibrating chariot floor under him, and the spread reins quick with life in his hands, and these lovely, fiery little creatures in the traces, his will and theirs at one. Turning with a soft muzzle against his shoulder, he said, "Will you let me try your team?" "They're not for sale. If they were, I could not afford to buy them. I asked that I might try them." "The commander also is a charioteer?" Craddock said. At the Saturnalia Games last year, Marcus had been put up to race a borrowed team against a staff officer reputed to be accounted the best in my legion, he said. Craddock did not seem to think his question answered. "I doubt if you could handle these black jewels of mine. Will you take a wager on it?" Marcus asked, his eyes suddenly cool and bright, and his mouth smiling. "A wager?" "That I will handle your team to your satisfaction, over ground of your own choosing." Marcus slipped a brooch from the shoulder of his ruffed cloak and held it out, the red cornelian with which it was set gleaming faintly in the shadows. "This fibula against one of your hunting spears. Or if that does not suit you, name your own stakes." Craddock did not look at the fibula. He was looking at Marcus, rather as though the young Roman was a horse whose mettle he wished to gauge. And Marcus, facing the cool, stock-taking, felt himself flushing. The hunter noticed the angry color and the arrogantly raised head, and a queer little twisted smile lifted one side of his mouth. Then, as though satisfied with his scrutiny, he said, "I will take the wager." "When do we put the matter to the test?" asked Marcus, returning the brooch to the shoulder of his cloak. "I am taking a draft of horses up to Durinum tomorrow, but in 8 days I shall be back. We will hold the trial on my return. And now it is time that we were away." "So be it," said Marcus, and with a final pat to a glossy neck, he turned and followed Craddock from the stable. They whistled the waiting hounds to heel, collected hunting spears from the house-place wall where they had been propped, and disappeared into the wilderness. Craddock was away longer than he expected, and the harvest, such as it was, there would be many hungry in Isca Dumno Neorum that winter, was gathered in by the time the trial took place. Marcus was turning over in his mind the question of getting in extra grain supplies when he arrived at the appointed meeting ground, a wide stretch of level land in the curve of the river, to find the other waiting for him. Craddock flung up an arm in greeting as he appeared from the wood shore, and springing into the chariot, turned the team and came thundering towards him through the swaying fern at a gallop. The sun flashed back in spars of light from the bronze ornaments on the breasts and foreheads of the team, and the long hair of the charioteer was flying like his pony's manes. Marcus stood his ground, though with uncomfortable tightening of his stomach, until at the last moment the ponies were brought to a rearing halt, almost on top of him, and the charioteer ran out along the yoke-pole and stood poised against the sky. "A pretty trick," said Marcus, grinning up at him. "I have heard of it before, but never seen it until today." The other laughed and stepped back into the chariot, and as he brought the team around, Marcus sidestepped and sprang in beside him. The reins and the many-folded lash changed hands, and Craddock grew back into the spearman's place, with a hand on the wickerwork side of the chariot. "Take them across to the dead ash tree yonder for a start." "All in good time," said Marcus. I'm not yet ready." The ponies were harnessed Roman fashion, the 2 inner to the yoke pole, the 2 outer by traces to the axles. So far, so good. But the chariot was another matter. Until now, his driving had all been done in a Roman racing chariot, a mere cockleshell, with room for no one but the driver. This thing was twice as big, though fairly light, and the open front gave one a sense of being on top of the team, which was new to him. To get the best out of chariot and team, certain allowances must be made, holding the careful separated reins high in the approved Colosseum manner, his feet wide planted on the interlaced straps of the chariot bed. He set the fidgeting team in motion, easily at first, getting the feel of them, then steadying them from a trot into a canter, as he headed for the silvery target of the dead ash tree. Just before it, he wheeled them obedient to Craddock's direction, and sent them weaving delicately down the curved row of javelins that the other had stuck upright in the turf before his arrival, in the same way that he had woven the white Arabs between the practice posts on Mars Field, his speed quickening to a gallop, but with never a grazed wheel hub to disgrace him. He took the team through every trick and test that their master ordered, until the moment came for a final burst of speed, and they were sweeping at full gallop round the mile-wide curve of the woodshore. To Marcus, that moment was always like being born from one kind of life into another. So must an arrow feel when it leaves the bow. It had been hot and sultry in the old life, but in this one the cool wind flowed against him like water, pressing his thin scarlet tunic into his body, singing past his ears above the soft thunder of the ponies' flying hoofs. He crouched lower, feeling the chariot floor buoyant and vibrating under his wide-set feet, feeling the reins quick with life in his hands, his will flowing out along them to the flying team, and their response flowing back to him, so that they were one. He called to them in the Celtic tongue, urging them on. "O brave hearts, on bold and beautiful, thy mares shall be proud of thee. The tribe shall sing thy praises to their children's children. Swef, swef, my brothers." For the first time he loosed the lash, letting it fly out and flicker like dark lightning above their ears, without ever touching them. The forest verge spun by, the fern streaked away beneath flying hooves and whirling wheels. He and his team were a comet shooting down the bright ways of the sky, a falcon stooping against the sun. Then, on a word from Craddock, he was backed on the reins harder, bringing the team to a rearing halt, drawn back in full gallop on to their haunches. The wind of his going died, and the heavy heat closed round him again. It was very still, and the shimmering, sunlit scene seemed to pulse on his sight. Before the wheels had ceased to turn, Craddock had sprung down and gone to the ponies' heads. After the first plunging moment, they stood quiet, their flanks heaving a little, but not overmuch. "Well?" "Well?" demanded Marcus, rubbing the back of his hand across his wet forehead. Craddock looked up at him, unsmiling. "The commander begins to be a charioteer," he said. Marcus laid the reins and lash and stepped down to join him. "I have not driven a team to better these," he said, and curved his arm over an arched neck. "Do I win my spear?" "Come and choose it for yourself before you go back to the fort," said the other. He had brought sweet crusts with him in the breast of his tunic, and he held them out to his open palms, to the soft, questing lips of the ponies. These four are the jewels of my heart. They are descended out of the royal stables of the Iceni, and there are few could handle them better than the commander. And there was a queer note of regret in his voice, for which there seemed no reason, but Marcus was to remember it afterwards. They drove back slowly, walking the ponies through the summer evening. "It will not harm them to stand for a little, now that they have cooled off," Craddock said, as after threading their way through the confused huddle of the town, he pulled up before his own house place. He drew the reins over the ponies' heads and turned to the dark doorway, calling, "Gunhumara, bring out to me my spears." The leather apron had been drawn back to let in what air there was, and the red fire glowed in the center of the house place. Marcus saw the tall girl rise without a word. She had been turning wheat cakes among the hot ash for her man's supper, and melt into the darkness of some inner place. Several dogs, which had been lying in the piled fern, with a small brown baby sleeping in their midst, came out with waving tails to fawn around their master. But the baby slept on, sucking its thumb. In a few moments, the girl came back and joined them in the doorway, carrying a sheaf of spears whose polished blades caught the evening light like so many tongues of flame. "The commander and I have laid a wager," said Craddock, "his brooch against one of my hunting spears. He is won, and now he is to come to choose his spear." As he spoke, he took one from the sheaf and stood leaning on it, with a gesture that said quite plainly, "But not this one." Those that were left were fine weapons, beautiful as were all the weapons of the Celts, perfectly balanced and deadly, some light for throwing, some broad-bladed for close work, some for war, some for hunting. The girl handed them to Marcus one by one, and he tested and examined them, finally picking one with a slender barbed blade and a cross piece just below the neck. "This one," he said. "It shall be this one, for when I hunt boar with your husband this winter." He smiled at her, but she did not smile back. Her face had the same veiled look that he remembered on it before. She stepped back without a word and carried the remaining spears with her into the house place. But Marcus had already turned to the hunter, for that other spear had caught his interest, and been in his mind even while he made his choice. It was to the rest of the sheath what a king is to his bodyguard, the shaft darkened with much handling, the iron blade perfect in shape as a laurel leaf, engraved with a strange and potent design that swirled like the eddies in running water. The weight of the head was counterbalanced by a ball of enameled bronze on the butt, and about its neck was a collar of blue-gray heron's feathers. "I have not seen the like of this before," Marcus said. "It is a war spear, is it not?" Craddock's hand caressed the smooth shaft. "It was my father's war spear," he said. "It was in his hand when he died, up yonder, under our old ramparts, where the fortress walls stand now. See, the mark is still upon it, his own blood and the blood of his enemy. He parted the heron's feathers to show the neck of the shaft, blackened by an old stain. A little while afterwards, carrying his newly won boar spear, Marcus made his way back towards the Praetorian gate. Children and hounds were playing together in the low sunshine, and here and there a woman in a hut doorway called the evening greeting to him as he passed. It all seemed very peaceful, and yet he was filled with an uneasy feeling that the peace was only a film, a veil like that which the girl, Guanhomara, had drawn behind his... A veil like that which the girl, Guanhomara, had drawn behind her eyes, and that underneath something very different was stirring. Again he remembered Hilarian's warning. For the collar of the old war spear had been lately renewed, and the heron's feathers were still bright with the lustre of a living bird. In all likelihood, that spear had been refurbished many times, kept bright by a son in memory of his father, and yet he wondered suddenly in how many of these thatched homesteads had an old spear been put in fighting trim. Then he shook his shoulders impatiently and strode on at the quickened pace up the steep way to the gate. He was simply growing toadstools, even as Hilarion had prophesied. All this because of a few feathers. Yet even a feather might show which way the wind blew. If only they could have a good harvest.